I bought my townhouse back in 2016.
Oh wow, is it back by chance behind the Chianti Grill?
Yep, kind of, a little more to the right, but
okay.
It's right across from Echo Hills Elementary School.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I have a friend who lives in that same area. Hi, Taylor. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Hello?
Am I reading that right, or is it telling me that I'm Taylor now?
Well, I'm not too tech savvy.
There you are. Hi. How are you? Happy
I'm
Saturday.
doing great. Can you hear me?
All right. I'm just going to pause for a second and run and get some paperwork, and I'll be right back in. And try to please write your name on here, and then also actually jot down Taylor's and just write on Zoom next to it if you don't mind.
What's his last name again?
At Taylor Allen, I think.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Taylor, you've seen the little cocktail lounge that I have in my office, right?
Yes, I have. Hello? Hello, hello.
He's on mute and not unmuting. Can you hear me still, Taylor?
Hello?
I was gonna tease with you guys this morning and tell you that we were going to tell you that we were gonna have morning cocktails. Baileys and coffee, vodka and orange juice.
Then I'm sure you maybe would have got a little more of a turnout.
You're probably right. I'll save it for February. I'm not gonna do it now since it's just you and me, because that might be a little weird. But Taylor, if you were in here, we'd be having a Bloody Mary. All right. Well, I think we'll just dive into it. So you guys are familiar with the kind of the summary that I like to give before each of my boot camps, talking about how I'm going to be describing this to you as if you're an owl personality, very analytical, someone who wants all the details, but I strongly encourage you to present these materials to the personality style of the person that you're working with. And then you guys have also seen kind of my tutorial of how on North Star MLS, they have a lot of good resources up here on the training library, and then how you can move your little sections around by just clicking on them and sliding them over. But we're going to go into the external links and into the Minnesota Realtor forms, and we are going to go to home. We're going to go to my file that I've already created, which is buyer bootcamp. All right, and then I need to share my screen, I realize. Let's see here. Share screen. Share this. And share. Okay. All right, the format you guys have heard me say before that I like to work with is over here on the right-hand side where I go down to forms, and I can see them all in one long straight line. We've talked about agency relationships on Tuesday, so I'm not going to go over that again, but just a reminder, that's really the most important form to have them sign first because it is our obligation to educate them. But it's also the best form to start with because it coaxes them into, I've educated you, you're getting your wrist and your pen warmed up, you signed that, there's no harm, no foul, it's just education, and that's gonna be number one. And you move on to the buyer representation form, and this one you guys are going to want to have ideally gone over with them at your buyer consult. So you will have wanted to have talked about this with them long before you make the offer. But every now and then, in working with a buyer, you luck out and you're able to make an offer the first time you've shown someone a house. And so sometimes you're doing all this paperwork together at once. Just like with the listing paperwork that I referenced on Tuesday, the date on the top right corner, the date that it starts, and the date that your buyer signs it would ideally all be the exact same date. Now, there is a possibility that you filled this out well in advance and they didn't actually sign it. So you know, maybe you filled this out with them in November and they didn't actually sign it until December, and that's okay. But that then becomes the contract effective date, meaning if between November and December they had made an offer with someone else, you didn't, even though you may have presented this to them, you didn't get their signature, and so you don't have a contract with them. You can make your buyer representation contract any length that you wish, and just like the seller's agreement, it's you're going to want to make it the right length so that it is speaking to their personality style, speaking to their needs. Most people, though, I do see write these representation contracts for 1 full year, which I think is a good, reasonable amount, especially in this challenging seller's market right now, where buyers tend to have to be looking at things a lot longer than they expected. If you were in the team meeting on Wednesday, you would have heard me reference both the buyer representation contract and also the listing agreement, and highlighting and letting you know that this is a contract that's important to the buyer. They want to know that they have a relationship with you, a contractual relationship with you, or technically with the brokerage. But it's also really important to you because this is what protects you to make sure you get paid. There are fiduciary responsibilities that we owe the buyer, but this is letting the buyer know that they are financially tied and obligated to pay us for our work. And they are also financially obligated to work with us, even if the buyer contract expires, but they're under contract under a purchase agreement to purchase something. And that is, I had highlighted it when I was presenting it in the sales meeting, and now of course it'll be hard for me to find it. But there's a line in here that says that that the buyer purchases or agrees to purchase a property within this time frame, which is really nice. So you'll let them know that you have obligations to them, that you're going to make reasonable effort to help them locate a property, that you'll always act in their best interest, and that they have obligations to us as well, that they shall work exclusively with us, that they will cooperate with us, that they will close on the property, and even go so far to say that if the buyer refuses to close on a purchase agreement that they may have executed, the buyer shall still pay the broker the compensation that is due under this contract. Now, I've never enforced that. I'm not sure that I know anyone who has, but it puts teeth in here to protect you so that buyers can't just, go under contract, be canceling them for no really good reason. This makes it harder for them to cancel when they understand what their financial obligations are. There's a large section here that talks about compensation. You certainly have the option to collect a retainer fee from the buyer at the time that you sign this contract. I know there's one agent in this office that's doing it now. He's not having a lot of people, he's giving them kind of a la carte options, and he's not having a lot of people choose that, but it is an option. It would be just a portion of your commission, and you actually get paid out that commission right away. So if you need some funds for something, it might almost be something that you could try if you wanted to, but that's the purpose of talking about the retainer fee there. Then we're letting the buyer know that as our compensation, we are typically paid 2.7% of the sales price. Sometimes it's 2% or 2.5%. That's not as common. And then there's an additional one-time flat fee called a broker administrative commission that they have to pay as well as a part of their closing costs on the day of closing. And we charge at this market center, we charge $4.99. There's real estate companies that charge much more than that. There's a few real estate companies that charge less, but our requirement is $4.99. Now, however, if they're utilizing a VA mortgage, if they're a veteran and they have that benefit, then we as the market center waive that. You as a realtor can waive this for anyone at any time if you wish, if you feel like, maybe you need to do something like that to sort of sweeten the deal to get someone to work with you. But then at the time of closing, you'd be paid 2.7 less all the Keller Williams fees, less the $4.99, and the rest comes out to you. I'm just noticing that there's something in the chat here. Oh, good. Okay. Taylor says, can you hear me? I can hear you. And I'm going to tell you, Taylor, I couldn't hear you for some reason, but I'm glad that you can hear me. Okay. So if you put in here that you're going to be paid 2.7%, yet you show them a house that is only listed at 2.5%, you could go back to them and say, hey, I am entitled to receive 0.2% from you directly, and you have to pay me that at closing. Again, I don't know anyone who's done that, but you sure could if you wanted to. We as the brokerage don't push you to do that per se. It also talks about how compensation is negotiable, but it's not negotiable between the buyer and Keller Williams Preferred Realty or you. It's negotiable between Keller Williams Preferred Realty and the listing real estate company. I do also want to point out that, shoot, I just totally lost my train of thought. Oh, I do also want to point out this item B underneath here that says, again, this is to protect you. So if someone decides that they are no longer going to be buying a house, or they just say, oh, you know what, my little brother just got his real estate license, or maybe they say, this isn't working out, we don't want to work with you. You do have the ability to still receive commission on any house that you have shown them. So within 72 hours after the expiration or the cancellation of this listing contract, you would need to provide to them a list. So you would send to them sort of a protected list of anything that you had shown or even exhibited to the buyer, meaning brought it to their attention. So you'd want to keep a list of all the automatic emails that you had sent to them, and anything, especially that they may have favorited or expressed interest in that you didn't even necessarily show them. Because if they end up going under contract with another real estate firm and buying it, you are still entitled to your commission. All those things are a little bit controversial. Not a lot of realtors push on those. Most realtors, especially at our market center, are in the interest of long-term and repeat business, not necessarily just this one commission and this one deal. So I think in the interest of a long-term relationship, you probably would push on that with someone. Any questions? All right. Then we go on to talk about the general nature of the property. So most of the buyer representation contracts that I see, they just have a check mark in here that says they're going to be buying a residential personal property, and that's totally fine. But when I was trained here when I started last year, they actually recommended that we check all of these boxes, and I can see why. There is a possibility that, heck, they didn't find a personal house, but they decided, you know what, let's buy some land and build a house. Or, I think I'm just gonna stay put, but I wanna buy some hunting land up north. Or, oh my gosh, I just won the lottery. I'm gonna buy a farm and I'm gonna be, I'm gonna be an urban farmer. Or maybe I'm gonna buy an investment property or something like that. So that you don't have to redo this document, it is our recommendation that you just check all of those boxes. We will also then be letting them know that we are realtors, highly trained in the field of real estate, but there's also a lot of areas of expertise that they're going to be associated with. Things like closing services, things like home inspection and home warranty that we are not experts on. There may even be some things that they need to secure an attorney for, or maybe they need a tax accountant's advice on. This specifically talks about the closing services, and we have to have them check either 66 or 67, which says that either they want us to arrange for a qualified title company and closing agent which is most common, or they'll check box 67 if they want to conduct that on their own or schedule that to be conducted on their own. The instances where I see this would be if you're working with a corporate buyer. So if you're working with some of those programs like Home Partners, where they're gonna, buy the house in cash, or they're going to do something and then the buyer is going to pay a fee on top of that. Those large companies typically have attorneys or title companies that they wanna work with directly, and that's fine. Every now and then though, you will see, as you're talking through this with a buyer, you will see a couple look at one another and be like, oh, that's right, Aunt Susie did tell me if I was ever gonna close on a house that she'd wanna be my title closer for it, and yep, we need to have her do that, so we'll just arrange it ourselves. But you need to give them the choice and they need to initial it. And then they also need to be reminded that in addition to the title fees, there may also be other things that they do have to pay, origination fees to the mortgage companies and prepaid things to the association or to the government for taxes. So there are additional costs to be able to purchase this house, and those are grouped together. They're called closing costs, and they're typically about 3% of the sales price of the home. We need to touch on with them this foreign investments and real estate property taxes, but I don't spend a lot of time on it because it is a little confusing and it definitely seems out there. But, and before I get into that, I just want to let you know there are some sections that I wish were reordered in these contracts, and this inspection and warranty is one that I wish was right up here under additional costs, because you heard me reference you'll have title fees, you may have a home warranty fee that needs to be paid, a home inspection that needs to be paid, and that falls in the category of additional costs that they may have to pay at the time of closing. So anyway, going back to the Foreign Investment and Real Estate Property Act, and you've heard this before, so this is just going to be a refresher and a reminder. If the person who is selling the home that now this buyer is going to be buying is not a U.S. citizen, if they are a foreign individual, that foreign individual needs to pay the appropriate taxes on the proceeds of their sale. And if they left the country, if they went back to wherever their residency is and didn't pay those taxes, the buyer is actually responsible for paying those taxes, which would be just an absolute nightmare. So you're at a huge financial strain. So you're going to want to be looking on the property disclosure to see if the seller is a foreign investor. They'll most likely say that they are not. So it would be very tempting on the purchase agreement to also just check that they are not as a convenience. But we don't want to take what they've written as their word for it. We want them to be the ones to take action to again reiterate that they are not. So I'll show you on the purchase agreement where you need to leave it blank, but then you need to go back and reference it. So again, I really don't spend a lot of time on this, but I want to make sure that you guys, as you're learning this profession, fully understand it. Now this section is boxed, and so it calls to their attention, of course, and this is coming right after you've described agency relationships with them. And so it's easy for you to reference that first document that you had them sign and say, so I am representing you as your buyer's agent. I owe all my fiduciary responsibilities to you. I owe no obligations to the person whose house you want to buy. But I need to let you know there's approximately 200 realtors in my office, and we are all licensed by the broker, Keller Williams Preferred Realty. And if I happen to show you a house that you fall in love with and you want to make an offer on it that is listed by Keller Williams Preferred Realty, we are now entering into what's called a dual agency relationship. Certainly it's logical that if you buy a house that I have listed, that's definitely a dual agency agreement, you understand that. But I want to make sure that you understand it's considered a dual agency agreement even if the property is simply listed by one of the other 200 realtors that I work with. So I need to give you the choice. Are you okay with that? Would you be all right if you bought a house where fiduciary responsibilities were given to the seller by someone at Keller Williams Preferred Realty and also to you as the buyer? And most people will say like, yeah, absolutely. I've totally grown to trust you. That's no problem. Every now and then someone will say, nope, I am not comfortable with that. That seems too closely connected. So I do not agree to dual agency. I think I mentioned on Tuesday in the bootcamp that this has only happened to me one time. It was with the seller, and the seller said, no, actually I'm not comfortable with you bringing the buyer, with you representing the buyer. So you'll sign that, they also sign that. We also then need to let them know just a handful of miscellaneous things. It's about a half page here. We need to let them know that I am showing houses to a lot of buyers all at one time. So you may be interested in making an offer on this house, but I might also have other clients that I've shown this house to that are also interested. If I represent you now, there is a possibility that you were represented by a previous realtor prior to working with me. I certainly am under contract representing a lot of other buyers as well. If we ever determine that this is not a good working relationship, we certainly can terminate the fiduciary responsibilities, and we would do that by writing out just a simple cancellation. I also need to be sure that you understand that as a licensed realtor, I have a code of ethics that I follow, and as a part of the code of ethics, I am not discriminating against anyone. A protected class, someone I cannot discriminate against, are predatory offenders, but I certainly understand that you may have some reservations about buying in a neighborhood where there may be a sexual predator who is registered in the area. So if that is a concern of yours, prior to writing an offer on a house, you need to go to the corrections.state.mn.us website and look that up for yourself. If you prefer to just call in, there's a phone number here as well. We also need to be sure to let you know that you are, by signing this, consenting or allowing me to communicate with you on all the various different platforms, text messages, emails, phone, mailing. Anytime that I might send you something to be signed electronically, we all agree that that is just as much a valid and a binding signature as it would be if you signed it in ink. And then everything that we do as a part of our contract is going to be in writing. We aren't going to have any verbal agreements, and it doesn't become an entire agreement until it's mutually signed by both you and the seller, or in this case, by both you and me, the realtor. So I want to let you know that on the first page here, when we talk about compensation, we previously had a line in here that allowed us to put in that broker administrative fee, but forms were revised at the end of last year, and so you'll find that this is taken out on some of the resources that you guys will be utilizing. So if it is still your obligation to provide the true cost or the true expenses to a buyer for purchasing a home, and you do need to disclose to them that there is this one-time brokerage commission of $4.99, and then it shall be paid as a part of their closing costs upon successful closing. So under the other section, you would just write it out something like this, or you can write 2.7 plus $4.99 in the commission line, whatever you're comfortable with, however you want to do it, but I will take it back to you for revision and initials if you miss it. Like I said on Tuesday, this is our chance to be very thorough. There's a possibility that you've been working with this buyer and you've gotten their email address and their cell phone number, but you have no idea where they live. So take advantage of this time and this opportunity as kind of an introduction to get their full address, to get their full phone number, all of the parties who are going to be buying, not just one. And if something happened to you, sadly, if you were in a car accident or COVID or in the hospital, and we needed to help your buyers, this is the very first place the Market Center would go to try to get information on your buyer. So please be thorough and fill it out here. This is a document that you sign on behalf of the brokerage and that they sign as well. So make sure that you both sign there. Any questions about that buyer rep form? My husband's texting me from Sam's Club with our 8-year-old daughter, and they're having a little too much fun. They want a pergola, they want a game table. Pretty funny. Daddy-daughter day. All right, so we'll go on then to the 2 additional Keller Williams Preferred Realty disclosure forms that you need to fill out, as well as the compensation disclosure that I need to have you fill out before making an offer as well. So, as I said on Tuesday, I love this form, this additional disclosure, because I can bring it out and I can really give credibility to the brand, Keller Williams, and specifically Keller Williams Preferred Realty. It gives me the chance to say, there are lots of ins and outs in the process of buying a home, and Keller Williams has seen it all. So they've brought to our forefront front a few things that they want to be sure that you are aware of, things that you may need to be doing, things that you just want to be familiar with that are common in the industry. So first and foremost, they want to let you know that before making an offer on a house, you must review the seller's disclosure, and the seller must provide to you a copy of the seller's disclosure. It is provided by the owner of the house. It's not provided by Keller Williams Preferred Realty. So if it's not available right at the time you want to make the offer, it's not our fault. It comes back to that seller directly. We also want to let you know that it is very wise for you to conduct a home inspection before going forward with the purchase. And you will likely make your purchase agreement contingent upon a home inspection. That is something that you have to hire on your own, that you have to pay for out of pocket. That is something that we'd be able to give you lots of good recommendations, but we can't schedule it for you. It's something that you have to vet and choose on your own. There's also a possibility, especially based on the age and the condition of the house, that you may ask for there to be a warranty placed on the home. And if so, it's something that you can ask the seller to pay for, or you can pay for on your own at the time of closing. It's like roughly, home inspections and home warranties each are roughly $600. And there are even some home warranty programs where you can place the warranty on the home at closing, but they have this nice optional seller's coverage. So let's just say you made an offer today to buy a house, but you didn't want to close on it until June. You were a little worried, like, oh, what if that air conditioner actually doesn't kick on in June? You can add the seller's coverage so that the seller would have a warranty to take care of any repairs between the time of contract and the time of closing. We also want to be sure to let you know that it is very commonplace right now that you're going to experience the situation where when you make an offer on a house, there might be other offers that are going to be placed at the same time and you're on a multiple offer situation. However, it is the seller's choice entirely to divulge or not divulge that information. And so, though I know it may be frustrating if I have to tell you that I don't have any information on it, it's something that you have to understand I don't have control of, that is in the seller's discretion entirely. If you are buying a house within an association, so it's very easy to predict if there's an association if you're buying a condo or a townhome, but it's not as easy to know if you're buying a single family home that might be a part of an association. So it is the seller's responsibility to provide you all those appropriate documents so that you can consider what the rules and regulations are, what the costs are associated with the association, and then you have a 10-day right of rescission where you can decide if you can live within those restrictions. But they might not get us those documents right away, and you will very likely be chomping at the bit. If the seller happens to be selling this house and trying to conduct what's called a 1031 exchange in order to avoid capital gains taxes or to defer their taxes, we would notify you of that, and the seller would need to work with a specific company to do that. It wouldn't impact our way in which you purchase the house, so that applies more to the sellers than it does to the buyers. I do want to remind you that we are experts, highly trained in the field of real estate, but not necessarily in building inspections, in accounting and tax advice, in appraisal issues or environmental issues, zoning and title types of things. If we end up needing to pull on if we have any of those questions and we need to pull on any of those professional services, it would be something that we would provide you with a list. You would have to select them on your own, and you would have to pay for it and hire them on your own. It's not ever something that the brokerage pays for on our client's behalf. I also want to be sure to let you know that it's Minnesota state statute that in a single family home, every bedroom have a carbon monoxide installed within 10 feet of it. So as we're walking through the houses that we like, we'll be looking for that. If they're not there, it is the obligation of the seller to put them in. I also want to let you know that closing day is a really stressful, busy, hectic day. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things that seem kind of unknown. We're going to put our proposed closing date in an offer to the seller, and we're all going to work very hard to try to meet that closing date, but there is a possibility that closing may get delayed, either because of you and your mortgage, or possibly because of the seller. And so you just have to be a little bit flexible and take a deep breath on that time of closing. I also want to remind you that we have the ability in so we are going to be going to the house either the night before closing or the day of closing, where you then are going to do a final walkthrough of the house to make sure that it is in the same condition that it was when you made the offer. Now, at the time that we walk through, it's very likely there's still going to be some odds and ends there. Maybe it's full of boxes. It's probably not yet been perfectly cleaned. But you need to understand that you are not buying a brand new house. You're buying a previously used home, and that it's going to have some minor defects. But when you sign at closing, you are agreeing to buy it in its current condition. So you have to go through, and I'll go with you at the final walkthrough to make sure that everything is functioning just the way it was when we made the offer. Any questions on that?
And what happens if you notice something that wasn't like up to them?
Yeah, so that happens a lot, actually, and that's what makes closing day kind of stressful and highly tenuous. You can not close on the day of closing and insist that the seller repair it, clean it, tidy it. A lot of times they leave leftover junk. You don't want to have to pay for it to be hauled away. So that's the biggest kind of threat that you can make is I'm not going to close today, but as you can imagine, that means you then also have to change your movers. You have to then wait for your mortgage because they have, their schedules are booked up and their underwriters are all booked up. And so you probably wouldn't be closing the next day. You might be closing a week from now. So you hold up closing or go back to kind of negotiating and saying, I'll buy the house for $500 less, or you'll leave me a $500 Home Depot card or something like that. Great question. Really good question. Taylor, do you have any questions? All right. There's a form here called the disclosure statement, the compensation disclosure to the buyer. And I'm not gonna lie, it's a little bit weird to talk about commission. They all assume we're making thousands and millions of dollars as realtors, but they don't realize what our expenses are, what our splits with our company are. And so it is a little bit hard to talk through this, but it is an absolute requirement that before you submit an offer on any property, that you have fully disclosed what you're being paid to do your work. And when I audit it, I do make sure that you sign this compensation disclosure either the day of the offer or sometime before. If it's signed after that, it's not the end of the world, but it is definitely something that could be an ethics complaint through the Minnesota Association of Realtors, and we don't want to get into any of that. So be sure to use this one-page compensation disclosure with every offer you make. You sign it as the realtor, and then they sign it as the buyer as well. Again, it asks for email addresses and addresses again. I think I went out of order just a little bit because I wanted to get that out of the way. Now I'm going to go back to the personal property agreement. Do you see that in there? Okay, good. So we are now moving into the phase where those are all documents that you would have gone over ideally with a prospective buyer before making an offer. Now, this is everything that you're going to need to do when you make an offer. I highly recommend, especially as you're getting started, that you print off, I know this seems old school, but that you print off this personal property agreement and that you literally bring it with you to every showing. Here's the reason why. When you go back into the North Star MLS and you look at, we're just gonna go here to this. When you look at a property, you're gonna look at it and you're gonna say like, oh, gosh, that's such a nice, let's get to the kitchen here. That's such a nice kitchen. I just love that, it has this gourmet hood fan here, but I'm noticing that there's a microwave over there. Oh, that's kind of interesting. And then now I'm noticing that in the bathroom, there's some shelves. And here I'm noticing in the bedroom that there's a mirror. There's just going to be little odds and ends that you will very likely forget about in the heat of the moment when you're ready to make an offer. So if there's things that your buyers are commenting on, like, oh my gosh, that shelving is so outstanding, or oh, I had that microwave, it was my favorite one that I ever owned, you're gonna wanna write those things down so they don't get forgotten. Because the most embarrassing things that have happened to me as a realtor are often the times that I show up to that final walkthrough and they say, oh my gosh, where are those curtains? Those curtains were exactly like the ones that my grandma had in her house, and it was so sentimental to me, and I loved them so much, and that was a good omen, and now they're gone, and what are we gonna do? Or here's a perfect example. That chest freezer, I was planning on putting all of my breast milk in there and expecting a baby in 2 months. Like, Stuff like that can be very, very, very stressful on the day of closing. So be sure to bring that with you. If you see something, write it down. If they comment on something, write it down, and then review and re-review it. You know, is it important to you to have that? Is it not important to you to have that? Do you have no use for it, so you want them to move out that old ugly garage refrigerator that the bottom drawers were full of mold? Be very, very specific when it comes to personal property agreement. And as you guys learn from your real estate classes, anything that is bolted in to the property is real estate. Anything that's not bolted in is personal property. And then there are things that are very gray, like the bracket that holds up the TV.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna ask that, I don't.
and the curtains that are on the curtain rods, so on and so forth. So I'll dig into the purchase agreement. We're gonna just jump right to it. Because they've updated this form and they've made it even more thorough. So they've written in here from lines 16 all the way down then to 36. They've said things like the bulbs that are in the garden, the plants, the shrubs, the TV antennas, the sump pumps. It does go on to say here the television brackets, TV satellite dishes, security system equipment. So it is all outlined in here. TV antennas, TV jacks and wiring, TV wall mounts are to be left. But you know, that almost seems illogical because usually those TV wall mounts go kind of partnered with the TV, right? But what I think they don't want people doing is taking down the wall mounts and then moving a big ugly hole in the wall.
Yeah.
All right.
And I assume you can add it to purchase agreement, correct?
For sure. Okay. Yep, for sure. All right, so I just exited out of the purchase agreement because I do want to show you something first before we get into that. You are going to find that buyers right now you're likely going to have to make a couple offers on houses for buyers before they actually get one, because they're going to go in wanting to stay strong to their conviction. They're going to want to make intelligent decisions. They're going to want to do the right thing, and they are going to insist that they have a home inspection. And I appreciate that. But to be competitive, a lot of people are having to forego a home inspection, or maybe they conduct a home inspection, but it's just for informational purposes only. So this is a form that the U.S. Department of Housing has put out and would be oftentimes a requirement if they are doing an FHA loan. But this is just a smart form that I'm going to recommend you have every single one of your buyers sign. This just lets them know how important we think it is that they conduct a home inspection, and if they elect not to, that's their choice. But we give all the reasons right here why we think it's really important that they have one. We've read this document. We understand that if we wish to get a home inspection, we need to do it as soon as possible. The difference between an appraisal from the mortgage company and a home inspection is outlined here, and we will make a voluntary choice whether to get the home inspection. So use this form, just get in the habit of using it, even though it's not necessarily one that comes from the Minnesota Association of Realtors. It comes from the federal government. Okay, so going into the purchase agreement, it is a long, lengthy document. It's going to feel pretty intimidating when you go over it with your first buyer, but just cross your fingers that they're a tiger and that they say like, oh, let's just scan through this real quick.
Yeah, I remember being a tiger for sure on this.
Yes, yeah, when you bought your townhouse, right? And you just trust your realtor. Now this purchase agreement has multiple uses. It's going to be used between your buyer and the seller. It's also going to be used between the buyer and their mortgage company. And then it's also used between the buyer and the title company. So this is the framework in which the offer is going to be made, but it's going to be referenced by a lot of other industry professionals. So it's very important to be thorough. You write the date that you're making the offer. It is really important to put the buyer's legal names on here. So if her email is, you know, ChristineKate1234@gmail.com, great. If her name is ChristyK1234@gmail.com, you've probably been calling her Christy and you'll call her Christy forever. But at this point, you need to say, hey, what's your full legal name? Because this is how the mortgage is going to be taken out, and this is how you're going to go into title. It even is wise to put, if not middle initials, their full middle names in here as well, especially in the land of 10,000 Johnsons and 10,000 Smiths. It'll just behoove them when it comes to title on their new home if it is written out as detailed as possible. I skip over the earnest money initially and I say, I'm gonna come back to this section, but I wanna talk with you about a few things down here first. So we are letting the seller know that we're making an offer on their home at 123 Main Street in the city of Burnsville in Dakota County with a zip code of this and a legal description of this. We're letting them know that in addition to the house, we also want to buy all these appurtenances to the property. Or there may be some things that we don't want, like if they've got a junky, rusty swing set from 1972 and you think that's a hazard, you can ask them to remove that. If they have 3 old refrigerators and 2 old deep freezes cluttering up their mechanical room in the basement and you don't want any of that, you can ask them to remove it. But we're letting them know that all of those things that we want in the home, in addition to the personal property agreement that we've already gone through, that we are willing to make an offer to them for $200,000 to buy this house. And that when it comes to that, we are not going to be buying the house in cash. We're going to be doing so with a mortgage. And our mortgage is going to be for $180,000 because we do have 20% in cash that we're going to be putting down. Put that here in terms of percentages, and of course, I think as you guys know, the more percent down they can put in cash, the more likely it is to be seen as a positive by the seller. Now, you kind of have to put your money where your mouth is at the time that you are making an offer, and we have a really handy way of doing that called trust funds. It's an electronic banking system that will allow you right out of your checking account to transfer to the company that represents the seller a portion of your down payment, and we call that earnest money. It's called earnest because we're sending it to them in good earnest. We're taking it out of our bank account, we're giving it to them, we're allowing them to hold it, but they'll then give it to the mortgage company or to the title company at the time of closing, and it'll be used as a portion of our down payment. It can be really confusing talking about earnest money first before you talk with them about the total percentage that they're putting down. So that's why I like to do this bottom part first and then go back up and talk about the earnest money. Earnest money is typically 1% of the sales price of the home, but the more earnest money you can give, the stronger your offer is perceived. So you can really do any amount that you want to. You just have to acknowledge that if for some reason you have to cancel this purchase agreement and not within any of the contingency timeframes that we write in, you would have to forgo all of that earnest money, and that would be a really big hit, especially to a first-time home buyer. So make a very cautious and balanced decision about how much you want to put down. The more the better, really, but it is industry standard that 1% is good enough. We're also going to let them know what the date of closing shall be on the home. Now, I have been trained and educated that some people may say, like, see below, and they'll write in the other section, or they'll write on an addendum, any closing date of the seller's choosing, or any time the week of December 18th to December 24th. And I get that, and you can do that, but it is really best contractually, because they say you don't have a closing date if you don't write a closing date in. It really is best to just write a date and then allow the closing date to be amended if the seller wants to change it, or if you need to change it, move it out, move it back, or whatnot. You can communicate that with the listing realtor and just let them know, I'm sending it over as an actual date, and here's why. When using the wizard, the property address, when you pull this from an actual listing, so like when you go down here to this white and green Instanet forms, it'll pull up a wizard like I showed on Tuesday, and then in the wizard, it'll pull forward quite a few things like the address and the legal description and whatnot. So you'll see that the date is going to be in the top right-hand corner of every page, and the property address is going to be on the top of every page. So you're letting the mortgage company, the title company, and the seller all know, yes, this purchase is contingent upon me being able to financially receive a mortgage on the property. I'm doing a first mortgage, and it does not include any type of grant or loan assistance. It's going to be a conventional loan. It's going to be amortized over a period of not more than 30 years and at an interest rate not more than 4 years. So I just wanted you guys to hear kind of my script of how I talk through this, but for your information, there is a possibility that they are getting a first mortgage and subordinate financing. What that means is, let's just say they've saved up enough to put 15% down, but they're so close to getting to that 20%, and if they had a full 20%, they wouldn't have to pay private mortgage insurance. So some people will take out a small subordinate financing amount to give themselves enough cash to make it look like they're doing 20% down, but really they actually have two mortgages, they have two loans on their house. It's most common right now, though, to just do a first mortgage. There's also a possibility that they may have some sort of grant or bond program or some sort of loan assistance. And if so, again, the mortgage company, the title company, and the seller all need to know, which is why we're disclosing it here. Depending on the type of loan that they're getting, may impact the decision of the seller to agree to work with us. So if they are indeed doing an FHA loan at 3.5% as compared to a conventional loan at 5%, we need to let them know. If they're in a rural area where they're able to buy with 0% down, you would use this USDA loan. If they're a veteran and they want to take advantage of their veteran benefits, then you would check line 61. And there's a possibility they might be working with, the First State Bank of Kearney, Nebraska, and that it isn't a typical mortgage, that it's some sort of, in-house, unusual circumstance lending. And so you need to let them know in full disclosure what that might be. It also matters to a seller if a person is getting a 15-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage. The payment on a 15-year mortgage will be higher, but as you can logically see, it will be paid off faster. So a 15-year mortgage may be seen as more appealing to the seller. This link, though, is what really matters to your buyer. Everything else kind of matters to the seller. To your buyer, what's important about this right here, some people will write in market rate, and I get that, that's fine. But this contract protects the buyer. We're in a environment right now where interest rates are going up. They're not going up rapidly, they're not going up gigantically. But if a person is buying their first house and they're just on those qualification limits, but they learn if the interest rates go to 4.5%, that adds another $400 to their monthly payment, well, then they've got a debt to income ratio where they can no longer afford that house. So this protects your buyer to make sure that if interest rates creep too high and they can no longer afford the home, that you could use this financing contingency to allow them to back out of it. So it's a really strong and important protection for them. So I recommend, as you're getting your pre-approval letter from the mortgage company, as you're submitting the offer, ask the mortgage company, hey, what's their interest rate? And then you would put an amount in here that's maybe like 0.5% or 1% higher than that. And you would ask them, do they have some flexibility if rates jump? And if they don't, then you may even just want to make this really tight at what their interest rate is right now. Make sense? I want to remind you, because this is such a long document, this is one that every page or two you should go through and use this save button here, because you're filling in a lot of information. You don't want to lose that time that you've invested. I just splashed my coffee on myself. Oh, by the way, my guilty pleasure favorite thing is a mocha from McDonald's, and they're super high calorie, so it's a really terrible idea. But terrible idea to have it. But I got one this morning on my way here because I had a showing in Excelsior before, and I was a little early, and I was like, I'm going to treat myself to a coffee. This one just does not taste as usual. Yeah, should probably even just benefit my hips and pour it out, right?
It's kind of like McDonald's Coke. Like I sometimes once in a while I crave a McDonald's Coke. I can't have a Coke like anywhere else except McDonald's.
Same. And their Diet Coke's really good too.
Yeah.
So yeah, totally. Okay. Talking about the mortgage financing contingency. Now, when representing sellers, you're going to want to look for it to be one way. When representing buyers, you're going to really desirable for the seller. But in a buyer's market, eventually it will be in your career, you're going to want to do what really protects your buyer, and this is what protects the buyer. It says, if for any reason a buyer cannot secure the financing specified in this purchase agreement above and it doesn't close, then the purchase agreement can be canceled and all earnest money would be refunded to the buyer. That's the most logical for the buyer, right? You could also right now in a seller's market say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I want your house so badly that I'm willing to forfeit my $2,000 even if I can't get my financing for some reason. That would really appeal to a seller. But the most appealing thing to a seller would be that if you would say this: the buyer shall provide to the seller or licensee representing or assisting the seller with a written statement on or before a certain date. That's usually 1 week before closing. It might be something like even a month or 2 before closing if you're making an offer now that isn't going to close until, say, early summer. And for the purpose of this contingency, this defines what written statement means. And what it is, it's prepared by the buyer's mortgage company. It lets them know that this person is fully underwritten for their mortgage, that it is, the appraisal is done, all the underwriting has been done, and we've completed all the conditions that the underwriters have asked. So this essentially says, anytime after this date, if you need to cancel on the purchase agreement, the earnest money would get completely forfeited to the seller. That makes sense? So if you're looking to make the very strongest possible offer on behalf of your buyer, you would use the second option here, and you write in a date that gives a lot of assurance to the seller. We also are saying that the buyer has the option of locking in on their interest rate at any time. In a volatile, changing interest rate market, the seller is going to want to see, like, hey, I'm locking in on this interest rate right away within 5 business days of final acceptance. But what I see most often, and what you are most often going to fill out, is that you're going to say at any time prior to closing or as required by the lender, my buyer can lock at any time. We also need to cover something pretty important here. So there is a home inspection that's paid for and hired by and done by you and your buyers. Then there's something called the home appraisal, which is something that is still paid for by your buyers, but it's actually done by their mortgage company. Buyers very often get the home inspection and the home appraisal mixed up. They kind of think they're one and the same. And we covered that on the Keller-Williams disclosure, and you can go into more detail on that if you want to. But where it's important here is, aside from any findings or any repairs that we ask the seller to do from the findings of our home inspection, our mortgage company is going to send out an appraiser, and the appraiser is possibly going to say, especially in the case of an FHA mortgage, the appraiser is possibly going to say, hey, you know, there's a loose handrail, the exhaust fan in the bathroom is actually venting into the attic. It's not going all the way up and out the roof. There's some things that are legitimate, like health and safety concerns here, and you as the seller need to repair those for us before we will issue a mortgage on this property for the new buyer. And the seller, of course, is going to say, like, oh my gosh, this is so annoying. I cannot believe, you know, if I was going to do this, I would have done it for myself when I moved in here. I'm not doing it for someone else. But you will have agreed ahead of time, per lines 118 to 127, how much at a maximum is going to be paid by the seller if something like this comes up. And then once the work has been completed and the seller has paid for it out of pocket, then the mortgage company sends that appraiser back out to do what's called a re-inspection. And they don't just do that for free. It's not like free gift with purchase. It's something that they charge you for. So they charge you a trip fee. To lighten the blow to the seller, though they may have some expenses they have to pay, to lighten the blow, you can at least say, hey, me as the buyer, it's related to my mortgage company. I agree as part of my closing costs to pay the re-inspection. But if you kind of want to put it to the seller and say, like, your house is trash, you have not taken care of it. If my appraiser finds something that you have to fix, you also have to pay to have my appraiser come back, because you just have let this house go into such poor repair. I'm willing to update it, but it needs to be at least in habitable condition for me and my mortgage company's satisfaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and isn't that something that's mostly, I mean, most all sellers will agree to, because it's not like I remember reading this in my courses, like they will mostly fix it because it's something that all appraisers will see.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. If it's called by your appraiser, you decide to cancel on the purchase agreement, it's likely going to come up by the next buyer and their appraiser as well.
Mm-hmm.
This, though, when thinking about multiple offer situations, this, though, is something where, you know, sellers can be really picky in terms of what type of loan they agree, what type of loan they will accept. So if it can be a conventional loan, those are a lot less strict than the FHA loans, because FHA loan comes directly from the government. The government, just has a lot of control of a lot of things. So if you can get your buyer to utilize conventional financing rather than FHA financing, that will typically benefit them when it comes to this type of thing. But there is a strong protection for an FHA buyer in this FHA escape clause, which says if for any reason, now, if your home doesn't appraise under any other mortgage type, you go back to the drawing table and renegotiate with the seller. And then you have to bring forth the difference between the appraisal and the purchase price if you really want the house, because the seller will likely say, no luck, I'll sell it to someone else. I'm not going to reduce my sales price down to your appraisal amount. However, in FHA, this tells the seller ahead of time, if my mortgage company appraises this for less than a certain price, which you write in here, which you write in the sales price, then I have the chance to cancel and get my earnest money back. Lines 140 through 146 or 147 are letting them know that if you are using an FHA loan or a VA loan, that there may be some additional fees that the buyer cannot be charged for, and that those things would either be paid for by the seller or paid for by the buyer adding it to their mortgage amount at closing. So if working, especially with a VA buyer, talk really specifically with their mortgage company about how they want you to fill this in. And I'm not going to go over it now because it'll probably change by the time that you do a VA buyer. So just know that if someone's a VA, put your antennas up. I know you're really going to want to ask specific questions of the mortgage company about that. All right, talking about closing costs. As you know, as I mentioned, the typical earnest money of a buyer is 1%. But in addition to their earnest money and their down payment, they also have to pay what's called closing costs on their home mortgage. So there's an origination fee, which is the money that they pay to their mortgage company. There's also fees that they pay to the title company, to the government, and those things all together total on average 3% of the sales price of the home. So if they hadn't saved 5% for down payment, plus another 3% for their closing costs, they can wrap those closing costs in and finance them monthly by asking the seller to pay for them. Now, if this is a $200,000 house, to make it be like no sweat off the seller's back, you would offer $206,000 to buy the house, with 3% going to the mortgage, to the closing costs. Keeping in mind, if you still only offer $200,000, then the seller isn't actually making $200,000, they're making $194,000. So you need to do a little math and play little numbers games here. If it's brand new on the market, you're probably going to have to offer $206,000, asking for the 3% or $6,000 here. If it's been on the market a long time and you feel like there's some room for negotiation, then you can ask the seller to reduce their net and just keep the $200,000 price. Make sense? Okay.
So like typically right now, obviously with it being a seller's market, then I assume that most, they're not asking for the sellers to,
And if they are, they're increasing the sales price to show that they're covering that. All right. Because we went over that we encourage you to get a home inspection, it makes talking through this section much easier. So we're going to ask them, would you like to conduct an inspection on this property, yes or no? They either elect or decline it. You can elect to have a home inspection, but not make the purchase agreement contingent upon the findings of that home inspection. So it would be like just for information only. But most people say that they do elect to have a home inspection and that the closing of the house is contingent upon what they find in the home inspection. We then go on to say that the seller either does or does not allow them to perform any intrusive testing. So intrusive testing would be like cutting out a piece of the sheetrock in the basement so that you can see the foundation underneath it, or opening up a wall in the bathroom so that they can see the plumbing or something like that. You have to then tell the seller, we will conduct our inspection and all the resulting negotiations within a certain time frame. So sellers are antsy right now in a seller's market. Sellers want their inspections to be conducted very quickly, and swiftly so that they can just move on with things. But I do caution you, home inspectors are busy. And then once a home inspector has been to the house, they'll provide a written report to you and your buyer within, usually 24 hours. After they've received that written report, then the buyer will likely take a day to read it and process it, maybe sleep on it and say, it's important to me to ask for them to do this repair or not do this repair. You then have to present that to the seller. The seller then probably has to get some estimates and kind of sleep on it and think about it. Then they'll probably negotiate back to the buyer. So you want to keep in mind, this isn't just like, I'm going to get an inspection within a certain number of days. This is, I'm going to get an inspection and do all the resulting negotiations within those days. If there are some things like, I want to inspect the septic system, I want to have a sewer line scope done because this is an old, 1910 house in Minneapolis. I want to see if there's any roots that are obstructing the sewer drain. If you're going to be conducting a radon test, if there are certain inspection items that you know upfront that you want to do, you want to write that in there just to give the seller a heads up on it so that it is pre-agreed that they allow you to do that. If you need to sell your buyer's property before being able to purchase this property, you would include what's called an addendum to the purchase agreement sale of buyer's property, and you would check here. Or maybe their property is already sold, it has a closing date and it's passed all of its inspections, then you would check option 2 that notes that. This is just contingent upon the successful closing of that property. Or what we see most often is that the buyer is just representing that they have the financial ability to perform on this purchase agreement without the sale of any other property. If they're buying multiple investment properties, for example, they've got the financing to be able to do this, even though they may own another home. When it comes to real estate taxes, it is most common that a buyer and a seller split the property taxes exactly on the day of closing. If you wanted to sort of sweeten the deal for the seller, you could theoretically say that you're willing to pay all the property taxes for 2022, which means that they make $200,000, plus at closing, you give them paid back for what property taxes they've already paid. So maybe that means they make $204,000. So you can use this to be kind of creative. I think it really came into play when selling farmland and kind of more complex transactions, because most often what we see is just they're fairly and evenly split in what's called prorated. You do want to make sure and look on the listing, and it's up here under, here we go. Under tax information, you want to look at what the tax amount is. You want to look and see if there's an assessment, pending, and if this property is in homestead status or not. In the state of Minnesota, you receive one homestead property exemption, and then any other properties that you own, you would pay a slightly higher tax rate. So the cabin would have a higher tax rate, the investment townhomes would have a higher tax rate, and so forth. So you're going to look at that when you make the offer, because if someone was buying my townhome, for example, it's an investment, it's not a homesteaded property, and property taxes are then going to go down for the first-time home buyer who's buying it. So if the property tax status is in a part or non-homestead classification in the year, the seller either will or will not pay the difference between the homestead and non-homestead credit. So I always just check that the seller shall not. The buyer can figure that out on their own, but the buyer does need to be called to their attention if it's going to be an investment property. If they're buying it as an investment, but this is someone's homestead, their taxes are likely going to go up in the next tax year.
Okay, but if they're not buying it as an investment, they have nothing really to worry about.
Homestead to homestead, yeah, it shouldn't matter at all. Now, I want to make sure that you really understand the importance of deferred taxes and special assessments, because unfortunately, it comes up a lot where a seller is going to say like, oh, that's right, I did get that letter from the city of Burnsville. They were telling me about the new sidewalks that they're putting in, or the new roads that are going in, or the new sewer system or water pipes or something that are going in, but they don't really talk, it doesn't come to mind when they're listing the house, but it comes up at title or in the tax information as we get closer to closing. So you're gonna wanna protect your buyer and just say that the seller shall pay all of these things. Now, the seller may come back to you and say, nope, we want the buyer to assume, or maybe it even says here in the listing, like, is there an assessment pending? Yes, and here's the dollar amount. Then you, to sweeten the deal to the seller, could say like, hey, I did my homework, I know that there's an assessment pending, and because it is going to be to my benefit in the time that I live there, me as the buyer, I shall assume it. Hey, how are you?
I just saw your lights were on.
Oh, thank you.
What are you doing?
Bootcamp. Do you wanna learn about boards?
I do.
I'm just kidding.
Which form?
You can teach this class, we're going over the PA. Lots of fun. Are you
Yeah.
holding some golden letters there?
Yeah, I found more in my car. I gotta get something else. So.
I love the vibrant colors. I'll definitely call their attention.
Yeah.
What neighborhood are you sending them to?
76th all the way down to 92nd, and then 35W over to Lindale. So all my neighborhood.
Great.
So I've never done this before. So
You're kicking off the new year in a good way.
I have to.
Good for you.
Gotta wind that spring.
I love
Hey,
it.
where'd you get those envelopes?
I think it was Amazon,
Okay.
but you can buy them in groups of 200. You can buy white ones a lot cheaper, but they would, people would just junk them. So these are pretty.
They are really great.
We'll see if they're worth it.
Thanks for stopping in.
Yep.
Have you met Jason before?
I don't believe
I
so.
should have made an actual introduction, but sorry that I didn't. His name is Jason Oliver, and so they call him Jolliver because he's just such a jolly guy. He's so cool. Really nice. Dad of, I think, 3 girls. And sold boats before he sold houses. So he's a good salesman, but he's really, really good at home sales. All right, so you are going to look at the seller's disclosure. You're also going to look at the property tax information, and you're going to appropriately check in what they have provided to you, which is that the seller either has or has not received a notice regarding any new improvement projects that might get assessed to the property taxes. Now, you may get into a situation where your buyer makes an offer on something, it's accepted. You conduct a home inspection, and then you're like, oh my gosh, this house has way more problems than we saw at first glance. We cannot afford all those repairs. We are sending over a cancellation. But in the meantime, they found another house just down the street. They like it just as much, and they're like, we can't lose it. We need to make an offer on this other house as well. Well, the problem with that is if the seller doesn't agree to cancel the first purchase agreement, and the second seller agrees to sell you that house instead, you're now under contract to buy 2 houses, and that is a major problem. So this is used in 2 different scenarios, similar and converse to one another, where you would need to let the seller know, hey, I'm super excited about making this offer, but I need to let you know it is contingent upon me receiving a cancellation of this previously written purchase agreement that I wrote on last Saturday, and I'm expecting the cancellation back from them no later than next Saturday. And they would need to base their decision off of, oh God, are we gonna work with these people, even though we know that they, are still waiting to get a cancellation back, and that may be a bit controversial. Maybe the seller doesn't want to sign the cancellation. Likewise, if you go to make an offer on a house, maybe it's been on the market for 2 weeks, and the seller's agent lets you know, hey, we're under contract with someone else. They changed the terms of their financing, we don't agree to that, so we've decided to cancel with them, but we don't have the cancellation back. So this can be put forth by either the buyer or the seller, but buyers and sellers agents need to be talking with one another about this if for any reason there's another contract that your client has or that the seller has on the house currently. Does that make sense?
Yes, so, I mean, if your client doesn't have, another contract, you just leave it blank when you send it.
You say is not.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you check is not.
Because then what if the seller then has one?
Then you check that it is. This purchase agreement is subject to
Okay.
cancellation of a previously written purchase
So
agreement.
first you would obviously then contact their agent and, okay.
And actually, without having to contact them, I would just send the offer over this way,
Okay.
and I would let them respond back to you and say, hey, we really want to accept this, but we need to let you know we're waiting for cancellation.
Okay.
And then you would just amend it in a simple one-page form. You will receive clear title to the property when working with a title company and utilizing title insurance, so you will most often receive a warranty deed. However, you're going to want to look really closely on the listing to see if, for some reason, it's being sold by an estate, it's being sold by the kids of someone who's maybe in a nursing home, or if it's a foreclosure, it's being sold by a corporate entity. And in that case, then you wouldn't receive a warranty deed, you'd receive like a personal representative's deed or a trustee's deed. There's also a possibility that you'd represent a buyer who's using contract for deed financing. So up the ante on your professionalism. It's definitely a rookie mistake, and I even still make these mistakes, but if you just quickly say, yep, we'll receive a warranty deed, and then the seller's agent gets back to you and says, well, as I said in the listing under agent remarks, this is being sold by an estate, so you're not getting a warranty deed, you're getting a trustee's deed. So just make sure and look at the listing really thoroughly before you work through this section and check something that's gonna make you look maybe a little less polished.
And is there anywhere else besides agent remarks that may?
Yeah, a good spot to look for it would be in the property tax section here, because it tells you who the owner is. So in this case, this is owned by John and Carolyn Leach. But if it were a trust, for example, it might be like the Leach Family Trust.
Okay.
Or maybe you've noticed, that the seller's disclosure was signed by Susie Leach, and Susie says AIF, attorney in fact, and she says, yep, I'm signing all the paperwork on behalf of my mom, Carolyn, my dad's already passed away. So look at the property tax information. Now, in a competitive seller's market where buyers are having to do everything possible to make their offer appealing to a seller, something that is small and simple that you can do is you can offer to take possession of the property at a time, sometime after closing. Now, your alarms are going to go off and you're going to say, oh my gosh, that's totally risky. And yes, it is risky. There's no question about it. But it's not so risky that it is a faux pas. It's something that's right here in the contract. So if you're moving out of an apartment, you don't need to be out until the end of the month, and our closing date is on the 20th. You may say to the seller, hey, I know how stressful closing date is. I know you're closing on your new house the same day, and making these moves within a short amount of time will feel really overwhelming. So I'm gonna make it easy on you. I'm gonna say, hey, let's close on Monday morning, but I don't need to take possession of the house until Monday at 9 p.m., or maybe it's even Tuesday at noon, or maybe it's even a week after closing. I mean, literally, it could be like almost any time. I don't recommend giving them more than like 1 or 2 days, but this would be a way that you can make your offer seem more appealing because it is less stressful to the seller. We go on for a couple pages now here of just a lot of definitions and a lot of kind of little tidbits of information. So I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. I strongly encourage you to read these couple pages, page 7 and 8. Seller agrees that they will remove all debris and all personal property not included here from the property by possession date. So that means they can't have left, the rakes and the shovels that they couldn't fit into their car. They can't have left all the packing materials in the basement. The seller fully agrees to remove everything from the property so that it's completely cleaned out. They also warrant that they will permanently disconnect anything that they had access to, anything that's on the cloud. So things like their wireless cameras and their Ring doorbell and whatnot. We also understand that all things that are prorated, so like water, sewer, electricity, association dues, will be split evenly, will be prorated from the beginning of the month by both the buyer and the seller. Also, something that's really important, if you're selling a property on acreage, it is likely that they're not connected to natural gas like every other house in the city is. They're gonna have what's called a propane tank in their yard. And the propane tank is filled usually like once or twice a year, and they pay a large amount to have that filled, so like a few $100. So whatever is remaining in the propane tank then needs to be paid for by the new buyer, and they literally just bring a check on the date of closing. But don't forget to mention that to your buyer of an acreage property, or the seller's gonna come to you and say, all right, we just had our propane tank measured and now it shows that you owe me, $550, and the buyer's gonna say like, oh my gosh, crap, I didn't budget for that, so please remember that. As quickly as reasonably possible after the final acceptance date, the seller and the buyer are both going to go to work right away, starting what they need to do from their title company. And that the seller, to their very best ability, is going to provide marketable title by the date of closing. Goes on to say that if they cannot provide marketable title, that they'll have an additional 30 days to work on it, or the buyer and seller can further extend the date or cancel it. And that if they can't provide clear title, that all the earnest money would be refunded to the buyer. If this is a property that can be subdivided, and that's a requirement of this sale, it outlines it here. If anyone has done work on the property but didn't get paid for it, they can file a lien on the property, so that's describing that there. The seller is saying that they have not received any governmental notices in regards to the house being condemned, any violation of an ordinance or a regulation. The buyer is acknowledging that any dimensions and square footage that's put here on the listing, so in terms of like what the room sizes are, in terms of what the total square footage is, and the lot size and the acreage, it is the buyer's responsibility to verify all that. So the seller is giving information to their best of their ability, which might be approximate, and the buyer is acknowledging that they have to conduct their own measurements if they're concerned about it. The seller is going to allow reasonable access to the property to the buyers for anything that they need to get in there for. So any repairs, any appraisals, any inspections, any surveys and whatnot. If sadly there was some sort of natural disaster to the property between the time of executed agreement and closing, the seller would be responsible for bringing the property back up to its condition, and that the buyer, if they didn't want to buy the house, if there's been some sort of natural disaster, they can cancel the purchase agreement, and it says that all earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So that would be like if there was a fire, if there was a tornado, if there was other sort of storm damage. Letting us all know that time is of the essence, that really you can drag your feet in sort of a negotiating tactic, but it doesn't usually help the case, that we want to work as swiftly as we possibly can. We have definitions here of what are business days, what are calendar days, how do we calculate those number of days. Every day ends at 11:59 p.m., but business days and calendar days might be different. If the buyer and seller agree that the earnest money shall be returned, these are the orders in which the earnest money would be released. If either the buyer or the seller defaulted on this contract, this is Minnesota State statute and information in regards to how that would happen. And then we remind them again that we are not allowed to discriminate against anyone, and therefore we're not allowed to give them any information regarding sexual predators, but they can go to the Department of Corrections website to look at that themselves. We are reminding them, like we did on the Keller-Williams form, that they do have the right to a walkthrough review of the property prior to closing on it to establish that the property is in substantially the same condition as the date that they made the offer. And we are now at this point letting everyone know that we as the buyer have either received a full seller's disclosure, or we've received a seller's disclosure alternative. If those things weren't available for you at the time that you made the offer, you want to go down here, the other section down here in the 400s, and say this purchase agreement is contingent upon the buyer receiving a disclosure statement from the seller, or buyer understands seller is not going to be providing a seller's disclosure statement. So write something if you don't check either of these two boxes. If they are within a municipality that requires what's called a truth in housing report, they do it for safety and neighborhood care and quality in cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Louis Park, Richfield. we're saying here that we have received a copy of the inspection report required by the municipality. If you haven't, that you also write that down here in the other section. So buyer has not received a copy of the St. Louis Park Truth and Housing Report, and the purchase of this home is contingent upon receiving that. More on that at another time. We then go on to talk about, is this home connected to city water and sewer, or is it connected to a septic and a well? And if so, we would say that this purchase agreement is subject to an addendum to the purchase agreement in regards to the well inspection contingency. We're also letting the seller know here, do we want them to pay for a home warranty plan, or do we intend to purchase a home warranty plan of our own? And most often people check line 393 that says no home warranty protection plan is required. We would list out the listing realtor's name here, and you always put your name in, or it's auto-filled in for you as the buyer's agent. However, just remember, if it happens to be listed by Keller Williams Preferred Realty, even if it's not you, it's automatically considered dual agency. So then we go on to say that either this is or this is not dual agency. And in this case, we said that it was because it's listed by Sarah at Keller Williams Preferred Realty. And if it does not, your buyer and seller do not have to sign it. But if it does, then it is a mandatory signature. Again, we talk about that foreign investment in real estate. If the seller is a foreign individual. We also remind them that they may have to pay some additional closing costs, which will effectively increase their cash outlay at closing. And we let them know that the buyer and seller are going to authorize a title company and a title closer to disclose and provide copies of the settlement statement, and also to you and all real estate licensees involved in the transaction at the time that these documents are available. So everyone will see what's called the closing settlement statement. This is not a fully executed purchase agreement until it is signed by both parties, delivered to both parties, and the date of final acceptance is included in that. Talking again about electronic signatures are just as valid and binding. This entire agreement is going to be in writing, it's not going to be verbal. And all warranties specified in this purchase agreement shall survive the delivery of the deed or contract for deed. I really don't even know what that section means, I'm not gonna lie. The date of this purchase agreement is going to be defined as line 1 in the top right-hand corner of the multiple pages of the PA. Oh, and again, remember to be saving this as you go through. If there are other terms that you want to write in here, so something would be like buyer is a directly related relative of the real estate agent, or we include an escalation clause in this purchase agreement. We are conducting a home inspection, but it is for informational purposes only. I see a lot of miscellaneous kind of random things written in this other section. Now, if you are going to include any of these addendums, so you're going to want to scan this every time after you've put all of your documents together, you need to put a checkbox in for it. So if it was built before 1978, if there's a lead-based paint disclosure, you're going to want to put a check mark here. If it is on a well and septic, you're going to want to put a check mark here that it's subject to this well inspection contingency. If you are going to be closing and letting the seller rent it back from you, or if you're going to be moving in before you've actually closed on it, there's just a variety of things here. You'll most often just have this addendum to the purchase agreement because you'll likely have some sort of addendum for something. So, as we've talked about the foreign investment in real estate a few times, I'm going to remind you that when you're submitting an offer and having your buyer sign on the right side here, you're not going to check either or. But before it is a finally executed document, you're going to want to make sure that the seller has signed it and that the seller has checked whether they are or not a foreign person. And it's going to be annoying because many sellers are not going to remember to do that. But me, as your broker, as I audit these files, I'm going to be kicking it back if not. It's also incredibly important if you enter into negotiations and there are counter offers that you, and it will likely come from the seller, that you make sure there's a checkbox here. And if so, you don't write in a final acceptance date on the PA, you leave it blank. The final acceptance date will go on the counteroffer. All right, that is a ton of information. And as you can imagine, it is pretty overwhelming for a buyer, especially a first-time home buyer, especially a first-time owl home buyer who's gonna want you to go over all these details. So I get to this point and I say, okay, I'm not gonna make you sign here. We've got a few more things that we need to go over. Any questions? How are you guys feeling? How's this going? You're like, oh yeah, that is totally a lot. So, small talk, chit chat, move on, but don't have them sign yet. So I'm gonna exit this because you'll notice in bold, all capitals, and in a box down here, it talks about arbitration. So this is a good way to sort of change the subject and move on. So I pull out the arbitration form, which should be next in your packet, and I let them know, okay, I wanna let you know, we are doing everything in our possible to make this be a good and a harmonious transaction between you and the seller. However, once you close and move into your house, there absolutely is a possibility that you're going to discover some things that are frustrating to you after you've moved in. And if you do, there's essentially 3 options for you. You can take the seller to court in small claims court. You can also simply sue the seller and take the seller to court. Or you could use the system that's been designed for real estate called the arbitration system. I am not a lawyer, so I cannot give you legal advice. I can't tell you at all what to do on here. You have to decide. And it seems a little bit pressure-filled to have to decide right now. But the reason they want you to decide right now is they don't want you to have to decide once this conflict has come up. They want you and the seller to agree how you'd handle a problem should a problem arise. What I can tell you is that I, as a representative of Keller Williams Preferred Realty, also have to agree or decline arbitration. So I'll be signing here an agreement because Keller Williams Preferred Realty does ask all of our agents to agree to arbitrate should the buyers also agree to do so. So I'm signing right here to let you know. I want to give you a scenario. So let's just say you move into the house and you discover that a 4-season porch was put on the back of the house, 3 years ago. And you've moved in and you've discovered like, oh, every time I set my cup of coffee down on my coffee table here in the porch, I'm noticing like my coffee is really, it's clear, it's not level, it's like at an angle. I'm afraid that maybe they didn't do the footings right in this 4-season porch. So you would have a contractor come out, take a look at it, they'd verify and they'd let you know like, yeah, this was a do-it-yourselfer project. This was not done right. I'm not even sure that they pulled all the proper permits. So you would pay a fee, you would go to this website here and you would ask for an arbitration claim to be filed. A non-biased arbitrator would then be assigned to the case. They'd ask you to provide them a lot of documents and they would call you you'd be at your house, they would call the seller to the house and any other parties that are pertinent to it. So occasionally the realtor is called to the house, not always. I'd be there for you because I want to be there to support you. But lots of other professionals would be there and it would all be handled on site. As a comparison, if you were to take them to court, you would sit in a courtroom in front of a judge who maybe knew something about 4-season porches or maybe didn't. They would rule on the case and it would be over. But in terms of arbitration, it's intended to be a more efficient way to handle these disputes because it's done at the house and it's technically done for less than it would be if you had to take someone to court. You will likely still hire a lawyer, even if you have to go through arbitration, but it's put to you as an option of a more efficient way of handling disputes should they arise. So how do you feel about it? Would you agree to arbitration or do you think it'd be better for you to decline arbitration? And they're gonna ask a lot of questions like, well, does that mean that I can't take them to court? And what's the dollar amount? And it's all listed out in here. So encourage them to read about it. I encourage you to really read it thoroughly. So that they either sign this saying that they agree or they literally write a line through that says declined. Now, if you are sending it to them for signatures, there's a checkbox where they can either say, yes, I agree and sign it, or checkbox that says, nope, I decline it, you move right past it. But then as a second level, if they didn't sign it in electronic signatures, you're gonna wanna go back in and write declined on here so that it's clear. If it's just left blank, it looks to me like you didn't even go over the form. The words decline have to be somewhere on here. Now, it's a big decision for them, and even if they come to the point where they say, yeah, we're gonna agree to arbitration, that doesn't mean that the seller will agree, and it also doesn't assure that the seller's realtor will agree to it. So it feels kind of big and heavy. It isn't really that big of a deal. But we did have one arbitration claim here in the market center. We were representing the buyer, and it was this year, and it was a huge deal. I'll actually be talking about it at one of the upcoming team meetings. So it's real, and it's weird to cover it at the time that you make an offer, but it's important that you do that.
So if they don't agree to arbitration and say they notice that, then they're kind of just, that's, you know, that's.
Well, they
all
just have to hire an attorney,
Okay.
go to court, yeah, which would be way more expensive. All right, so now that they've talked about arbitration, then we go back here to the purchase agreement. We scroll all the way down to the bottom and say, all right, so don't worry about whether you agree to it or don't agree to it. We can even set this form to the side and you guys can take, you know, a few minutes at the end of all this paperwork and talk amongst yourselves if you want to agree to it or not. But I need to let you know that on the purchase agreement, you need to sign acknowledgement. It's a voluntary agreement. It is separate from this purchase agreement, and I at least have described it to you. So it says, I acknowledge that I have received and have had the opportunity to review arbitration. And you sign here saying you reviewed it. Oh, yep, that's an easy signature to do. Okay, perfect. Then I'm also going to have you also sign up here. This is putting your signature saying this is indeed the offer that you want me to present on your behalf. I usually leave this wire fraud off at the time of the purchase agreement because oftentimes it's covered at the time that you're doing the buyer consult. But we need to remind them that when it comes to closing, they're going to be working with their mortgage company and they're also going to be working with their title company. And it has happened, and it did happen in this market center even just this year, that they may be like, hackers are watching for this. So they may be hacked and they may receive a fraudulent email that tells them where to wire transfer their funds from closing. And so they have to be watching really closely to make sure that they literally call their title company or their mortgage company and say, is this exactly where I'm supposed to send it to? Never wire funds without confirming it. And this is just a CYA for us, saying that we alerted them to the possibility of wire fraud. So you're gonna wanna have that signed with every buyer or seller. I just don't necessarily do it right here at the time of PA. All right. We have been sitting here for an hour and a half. I feel like we should take a little break. I'm sorry that I hadn't already. I'm gonna grab my water. Taylor, do you need anything? Are you in need of a little break?
I'm all good.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna just say, like, let's take a 2-minute break. I'm
Yeah.
just gonna run to my office, run to the ladies' room or something if you need to. And then we have just a bunch of miscellaneous addendums to cover in the last half hour. Cool.
Stuff, yeah.
All right. Can I get you that Bailey's and coffee?
I'll be in bed by then, like 4.
Oh, funny, my water's in here. I thought it was in the glass. Pour this coffee out so I don't keep need to go to it. All right, let's get back at it. So if you know that the property that you're making an offer on is a part of a common interest community, a part of an association, you need to, you need to fill out this addendum. It's really long and it's really lengthy, but it is state statute that anyone who buys within a community like this that has rules, regulations, budgets, and whatnot, that they have 10 days to be able to review all those documents. So it is way wordier than I think it needs to be. So you can, depending on the personality type of your buyer, cover all of it or cover it just in this summarized way that I did. But this is a protection to them, and you're gonna have them sign, I think it's page 4. Yeah, all the way down here on page 4. There's really not much to fill in, but you just have them sign it as a buyer. Then, if you notice in the supplements to a listing that there is a copy of the association documents already, if the seller has been really proactive and they've collected those documents already, you can actually modify the 10-day right of rescission, and you can say, hey, we've already reviewed those, but you can only modify them down to 3 days. So you can use this box number 44 here that says, we wish to modify the 10-day right of rescission to a total of, maybe you'd say 5 days, but you can only go as low as 3 days. Does that make sense? You said that you've received their disclosure statement that was signed, that was dated this day, and you're saying, yep, I've seen it all, and I wish to reduce that rescission period down. Now this form, in all honesty, isn't used very often, but if the seller has taken the time to put those documents out there, the reason they're doing that is they're wanting to be efficient in terms of timing, so just go ahead and meet their needs. You're also going to want to, and I talked about this in the seller's bootcamp and said that you as the seller are required to provide all these documents, but it's good for you to be proactive in representing a buyer and fill this out for your buyer as well. You can use this as a little checklist for the things that you're going to be looking for to get from the seller. So you're going to want to make sure and get the full disclosure statement, the declaration of the association, any amendments to those declarations, articles of incorporation, bylaws. That's all a whole bunch of legal mumbo jumbo. But then what you're really going to want are the rules and regulation as well as the projected budget. And then it's a good idea to have your buyer actually sign this, because if your buyer came back to you and said, oh my gosh, I moved into my new townhome and now all my neighbors are frowning at me, and I even got a nastygram from the property management company saying that I can't have my Rottweiler. You know, this Rottweiler is my pride and joy, and they're telling me I have to get rid of it. Well, you could go back and say, I didn't even know you had a dog, but I gave you those rules and regulations. It's right there on page 1. This is another good CYA type of document to protect you, to make sure that you've given them what they need to know to make an informed decision. There's also going to be something called a resale disclosure statement that you'll receive from the association, and that needs to be signed and dated by your buyers as well. But that's not in here as a standard form because that is generated from the association. If they need to sell their house before being able to buy a house, you use this addendum to purchase agreement sale of buyer's property. You can either let the buyer or the seller of this new house know that you've already listed their property, or you're going to be listing their property. So you'll always put in, most likely you'll put in here that you're going to be listing it. If it's out of state somewhere and you can't, then you would write the real estate company that's listing it there. You put in the property address that needs to be sold, the property that you're trying to buy, and then you check either or it's currently listed or will be listed within a certain number of days. It's just a 1-page form, and your buyer will sign at the bottom. I think today is a good time to clarify the difference between an addendum to the purchase agreement and amendment to the purchase agreement. And they look very much the same. They're both just kind of, notebook paper that you can put some miscellaneous things on. But an addendum is something that you would use at the time that you're making the offer, and an amendment is something that you use after the fact. So if they've done the home inspection and you found that you want them to repair 4 things, you would put it on an amendment to the purchase agreement, because you're now changing the terms of the purchase agreement, you're amending it. You're not just adding to the terms of the purchase agreement, you're amending it. So this might be something like, oh, yippee, our loan is ready early, we want to move in early, we're proposing to you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, that the closing date shall be amended from February 1st to January 15th. So that's the difference between an amendment and an addendum. There's something called a seller rent-back agreement. So let's say you live in that apartment, you weren't really planning on moving out of your apartment early, but you recognize that you're probably gonna be house shopping for longer than your buddies did 3 years ago. So you get started, right away, and then you find the perfect house, you're gonna swing at it, you're gonna make an offer, but you don't really want to close until June. You can say to the sellers, hey, I'm gonna buy this house, I'm gonna close on it March 1st, but I'm gonna allow you to rent it back from me. You're gonna stay there until I can move out of my lease. And a lot of sellers might really appreciate that, actually. This is usually something that a seller is going to put out there as, hey, I wanna rent this back until the end of maybe 22 or whatever. This gives you the choice to either include it with your initial offer as an addendum or add it as a change to the purchase agreement later. And then it asks, when do you want to have this move in and exactly what time of day? It almost serves as like a lease. It says you're going to ask the sellers to give you a security deposit. You're going to give it back to them if the house is still in good condition. This is what the monthly rent is going to be, calling it a rent back fee. It clarifies who pays the utilities, who pays the insurance, who does the maintenance, how they allow you to use the property. The buyer's not responsibility for claims or expenses from the seller's use and possession while they're there. You're asking the seller to quietly enjoy it if we need to terminate this contract. So like I said, it's almost a little mini lease. So the buyer sign as usual on the bottom right.
Is this common? Never even heard of this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not super common, but it is common right now because these buyers and sellers have so many, there's so many tricky situations. Yeah. There's also something called the buyer's move-in agreement, and I didn't put this in here, but that would be the same kind of thing, where the closing isn't going to be for another time, but maybe the property is empty and the seller agrees to allow the buyer to move right in and rent it from them. Actually, I'm just gonna look that up because rent. Seller rent back, buyer move in. Makes sense to have that in there, so let's move this in.
So for the seller's rent back agreement, this could be, for example, if the buyer is waiting to sell their home currently.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So it looks almost exactly the same, and it's just called a buyer's move-in agreement. Very good. Other things, let's see here. So scroll down. Oh, I totally skipped something. I forgot to tell you about the counteroffer. So if when you send over an offer, the seller says, I want to work with you, but there's a few things that I want you to do differently. Maybe they say, sure, I'll pay your closing costs, but I'm going to bump the sales price up even higher to $210,000. And your $2,000 earnest money is okay, but there's someone else who's willing to give us $5,000 earnest money, so I'm asking you to do that. And the closing date that you gave was fine, but we'd rather close on December 29th. So they put check marks in for these commonly negotiated items. You can also click the other section and type anything else in there that may be important to you. I want to now include the Corvette that's in the garage. No, I'm just kidding. Anything that's related to the property. I do indeed want to include the, so on and so forth. So the seller would sign that, they'd send it over to you along with the signed purchase agreement, and then if your buyers agree to it, then the buyers would execute it, and it would be your responsibility to put in the date of final acceptance there. So that's a counteroffer. If the property is on acreage and it has a well and a septic system, I highly recommend, though you don't have to, that you use this addendum to the purchase agreement and say that you want a well and inspection contingency. And you would outline here whether you want the seller to pay for a septic inspection and whether you want the seller to provide a water quality test. So that's how you inspect these two systems. So you have a plumber type company come out and inspect the septic system, maybe even pump it, and then you have the seller collect a water sample and then send it in, usually to the county, to get a water quality test. And that's just a simple 2-page form. It's nice because in addition to the home inspection contingency, it also gives you time to evaluate those two very expensive systems, which is super duper wise. Okay, I'm gonna go on to talk about the seller's property disclosure statement, because this is something that, as a homework for yourself, I'd love to see you just go through, like, oh, here, this would be fun actually. Let's search single family detail, and let's say we wanna see every house that's active in all of the Twin Cities that's 10 million plus. How many are there? Oh, only one. And this one happens to be on Lake Minnetonka. Oh,
my gosh.
actually, someone just told me about this. I think this is owned by the people who own Crave. This was a weekend cocktail party conversation. Cameron Talahidi. And I don't know if that's indeed the owner of Crave, but we can look it up. So, for the fun of it, oh, and they don't even have a seller's disclosure statement. For the fun of it, I strongly encourage you to go through some properties and just look at all of their disclosures, just to get a feel for, you know, how detailed some of them might be, how basic some of them might be. Oh, that's still the only one? Oh my gosh, okay, hang on. Now I'm just being nosy and curious. There's gotta be some properties that are 5 million, right? Oh, no, there's only 5. So where are they? Oh, on Lake Minnetonka? Oh, it's gorgeous. Minnetonka. Ooh! That's unique, isn't it? I wanna know. Oh, and what is this? In Scandia. Who's supposed to make that so expensive?
I know, I was just gonna say from the outside doesn't.
79 acres, so that might be why it has its own private lake. It's like a compound. Kind of fun. I suppose if you lived in Florida and wanted to come home to Minnesota and have your own little natural oasis, I mean, heck, you've got that waterfall right there. I love it. So go through and look at all these property disclosures and just familiarize yourself with it.
What did you click to get there again? I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. I'm glad you asked, actually. It is this white paper looking thing
Okay.
here where you'll see supplements. So let's look and see if the other ones have supplements. Floor plans, home highlights, disclosures. Here we go, here's a disclosure. Oh, and they used a seller's disclosure alternative. Shoot. So that doesn't really help us. Let's see if this one has it.
And for the open house, you can have, like, it's a good thing to have the disclosures,
Really good idea.
but only for agents to see, correct? Like, or cannot, like, actual
No,
just.
you can give out printed copies of the disclosure actually
If they
to
ask to see
anyone. But usually, well, it is actually required to have one on site within visibility for anyone to reference. They just wouldn't be able to take it with them. So you must have a copy of the seller's disclosure statement out. So this will be a more fun one to look through than my bootcamp form, because my bootcamp form is just blank. So it'll tell you, when did you acquire this home? It looks like they bought this home in 2011, though it was built in, so you know they're not the original owners, it was built in 1989. And then it says that they have not occupied this home, as it was just a summer home after 2019. Holy smokes, now I'm really getting nosy. Who lives here?
You know, must be some owner or something.
Tech Blake Rice. That is, okay. And did they receive a copy of the property disclosure when they bought it? Yes, they did, and so it is important that they attach it. Does it involve any sort of manufactured home? And it says no. Then it asks about flood insurance. It asks about, do they know of any encroachments? Are there any easements easements on the property? And they're saying, yes, there are. There's a driveway easement to get into the property. What's the general condition? So this is really helpful because it says, yes, there was wind damage to the roof and some tiles were replaced and the gutters are currently being replaced. Wind and hail as described in 1, they did receive compensation for those claims. Most other things are probably going to be no. Has any work been performed on the property? And they've given an attachment for that. They ask about the quality of the floor coverings. Have they had any pets? And yes, they have. Are there any problems that they know with the basement, like with the drain tile, any cracks in the floors and the walls? And they've given detail here, which is great. What's the age of the roof? It looked like it was a tile roof, so they've given lots of detail about that. This is something that they could have filled out by hand if they wished, or the listing realtor can send it to them to modify electronically, which is what they did here, and it looks a lot neater, but it almost is harder to find some of the details, so you need to look really closely when it's typed in. And then remember when I was talking about the seller's disclosure and the seller's bootcamp, it's really important to pay attention to, is it in working order, yes or no? And then the NA box would be checked over here if it doesn't exist on the property. So they don't have a fire sprinkler system, they don't have a furnace humidifier, they don't have any supplemental heating or an incinerator, for example. They do not know of a septic system, and they are saying that there is a well on this property. It is not excluded from market value in regards to property taxes. If it was a farm, there might be some sort of farm tax benefits that they're taking advantage of, and if you buy it but don't intend to farm it, your taxes would be different. Are there any preferential property tax treatments here? Again, that would be for the farm. This is where you would find if the seller says they are or are not a foreign individual. And then on the purchase agreement, you're going to want to make sure that they check that properly. They're saying that they are not aware of any methamphetamine that had previously been produced on the property. They're not aware of any human remains or any burials or cemeteries. They're not aware of any pest infestations, any asbestos, any formaldehyde. No environmental concerns. They have tested for radon and it was not found to be an elevated radon level, so they didn't need to put in a radon mitigation system. They don't know of any other material facts. Then it goes on to talk about mold and mildew. Talks again about those sexual predators. It's kind of that, and the foreign investors are woven in there in just what I think is kind of the weirdest ways. But once your buyer has reviewed what the seller has provided with his signature here, does that say trustee? Blake Rice, I feel like that says trustee. So in this case, you'd get a trustee's deed, not a warranty deed, which is a good example of that. So then you would have your buyer sign here saying they've signed receipt of it, and then you remember on the purchase agreement, they would do a checkbox that says they received a full seller's disclosure. So anyway, because that has so much detail, I strongly encourage you to review a few of them just to familiarize yourself with like what's common and what's not as common. Now it is possible, I'm going to do just a couple more forms here, it is possible that a buyer is going to ask you to represent them just as a facilitator. And you'll notice that this facilitator agreement looks just like the buyer rep agreement. I mean, it talks about compensation, it talks about that broker admin fee, it talks about the protected list of no more than 180 days, it talks about closing, again, it talks about FERPTA, again, it talks about sexual predators and electronic signatures. So they sign it just like they would if you were doing an exclusive to represent buyer's agreement. But what's different with the facilitator is if you're facilitating them, you do not owe them all the same fiduciary responsibilities. So this may be a case where someone comes to you and says, hey, my grandma just moved into a nursing home, my aunts have gotten together and they've decided, we'd offer this up to the family first and I want to buy it from them. My aunt is a realtor, so she's representing my grandma, and I want you to represent me, but I don't really need you to show me any other houses. I don't really need you to give me a CMA. I just know what they want to sell it for. I just want you to write a purchase agreement for me and help me arrange my inspector and my real estate closer. Can you do that for me? Well, absolutely. And what do you charge for that? Well, Keller Williams charges 2%. So rather than paying the 2.7%, you could charge your friend 2%. You could maybe even say, You know, do you think you could get your aunt to pay 1% and you paying 1%? However you wanna work that out is just fine, but Keller Williams minimum on this is 2%. And then you just go through and check the fiduciary responsibilities that you owe them. That would be a facilitation of a transaction. I also want to go over really quick contract for deed financing. So put yourself in the shoes of someone who might be new to this country. They may have different ways of thinking about things. They may have different cultural tendencies that they do things, you know, in their country of origin. And they may say, hey, I've been saving for the 5 years that I've lived here, and I haven't been reporting all my income, so I don't think I can get a loan, but I've got like $100,000 to put down. You could say, well, you know, maybe we can find someone to sell you their house and they would do the financing, so you don't get it from a mortgage company or bank, and that's called a contract for deed. It's almost like a rent-to-own. But a contract for deed, they literally change the title into the name of your client, even though the seller still has rights to it because they are giving you the mortgage on it. So that's called contract for deed financing. I've actually done it twice in my 20 years. I'm not sure that you'll maybe ever do it because it's just so rare that a seller's in a financial situation where they don't need to receive the whole sales price of the house right away. But there are some unique situations. So if you know someone who's willing to sell utilizing a contract for deed and someone who needs to buy using a contract for deed, you would check that it's not conventional financing, it's not FHA financing, this is contract for deed financing on the purchase agreement, and then you must include this addendum. It's our last two documents. We are at the tail end, and I know your brains are probably feeling a little overwhelmed. There are forms that are specific to Keller Williams Preferred Realty that are called the buyer or the seller hold harmless agreement. These forms don't get used very often, but it is a nice form to use if you're entering into some sort of situation that just feels a little bit unusual to you. So it says here that the seller, I'm actually going to go to the buyers because in the buyer bootcamp and we're representing the buyer right now, but just know the words would be conversed if you're representing a seller. It says that the parties, the buyers, understand that the agent will not provide the buyers with any legal or tax advice. The buyers therefore agree to seek independent counsel pertaining to this, and the buyer shall contact appropriate real estate attorney or certified public accountant in this case. The buyer further acknowledges that the buyer has been given the opportunity to discuss this transaction with legal counsel, and the buyers have utilized this property to that extent. So it holds you as the agent harmless of the buyer coming back and telling you that you may have given them any bad advice.
What kind of situations are those?
I audited, I've never used it. I've audited it once in terms of a seller, and I can't remember their specific situation, but it was an older seasoned agent here who inserted it, who used it. So I would guess it's something like maybe the seller had their real estate license 25 years ago and had maybe, you know, some strong opinions about something, and the agent said, hey, you know, you know a lot about this already. You've got this, you know, this real estate attorney who's your friend, who you've chatted about things. You have a very complex personal tax situation, so you've been working with your tax accountant. I just need to make sure to have you sign this release that you're working with those professionals in addition to me. Yes, so there you go. Now you can represent a buyer. Are you working with any right now?
No. I just got access to my MLS yesterday.
Yes, you're waiting to get, that's right.
So I feel like I have quite a bit of catch up to do.
Yes, I get it. I definitely get it. Well, I'm gonna go back to Taylor here. Taylor, how are you? I'm gonna ask you to unmute and just tell me if you have any questions.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Oh, shoot, and you
Yeah,
know
looks
what?
like he's speaking.
You have been trying to talk and I have not been able to hear you. There must be some sort of volume thing that I am not tech savvy enough for, so. I think, oh, look at you, you're all good, you're great. Oh, thanks for turning on your camera. I like the thumbs up. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday, okay? All right, thanks for listening in. You've already done your own purchase agreement, so this was just, this was like brownie points. You're an overachiever. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good weekend. All right, so we'll stop the share, we'll end the meeting.